Thank you to our channel sponsors, Jet.Build. If you're looking for ways to better manage your real estate development and construction projects, look no further. Jet is the command center software for end-to-end real estate development and construction management. That's www.jet.build. Mike, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Adam, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So where are you calling in from? Where's home base for you?
Home is just outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
Awesome. Nearby to my alma mater, Northeastern.
Yep.
Had a great time there. Awesome, man. So let's kick this off with a formal introduction. Mike Zeppieri is a West Point graduate with 5 years of active duty service as a U.S. Army combat engineer. Mike was stationed primarily in Germany, where he supported peacekeeping missions in the Balkans. Mike served as a platoon and support platoon leader and as chief of staff to a one-star general under HQ U.S. Army Europe. Today, Mike is the VP of Emerging Technology at Skanska, a Swedish global construction company. Mike, I'm really excited to hear about these experiences. But as you know, and as our audience knows, we like to kick off in chronological order. So let's hear about where you grew up and what about childhood led you to your service.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the community I grew up in is largely why I entered the service. So I grew up in one of the blue collar suburbs of New York City. So it was a suburban environment, so it wasn't the city. But most of the families there had roots to either the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island. I mean, most of the families there were immigrant families, so a lot of Italians, which is my family's background, a lot of Irish, a lot of Germans, and mostly blue collar. And my grandfather was a World War II vet. But what was interesting about the community I grew up in is it seemed like everybody's grandfather was a World War II vet. There was just a lot of veterans in our community just because of the nature of the community being a blue collar community. And we had a very active local American Legion. So during the summers when I was a kid growing up, whenever you had the typical military oriented parades, so the summer and the fall was dotted by Memorial Day, July 4th, and Veterans Day, and you would go to the local parade to watch your grandfathers march by. Everyone did, and you'd watch I'd watch my grandfather march by with the American Legion, and they had World War II era military vehicles, and it kind of planted the seed, which I think you'll appreciate because you served in Israel. Mm-hmm. To me as a kid, military service seemed like it was a given, it was just something that you did, and it was something that I admired and respected because my grandfather had a very quiet presence and I think you probably have seen this across many veterans. Veterans aren't very boastful. They tend to be very humble. And mm-hmm. You'd go to the barbecue at the American Legion and they weren't telling war stories and boasting about their triumphs on the battlefield. It was like a quiet respect for one another. And there was something about that really appealed to me that resonated with me. And I was like, that's what I want to be when I grow up. So my grandfather having served, and he wasn't career military by any stretch. I mean, he did his time in the Pacific Theater and came home and was a civilian. Similarly, my uncle, he was a Vietnam vet, and not to get into the politics of the Vietnam War, because that was kind of a very tumultuous time in the United States, but he signed up for service. Now he, given where my mom's side of the family grew up in the projects in the Bronx. So he had a draft number where he was very probably going to go to Vietnam, whether he wanted to or not. And he chose to kind of take control of his own destiny because his dream was to be a pilot. And he went to the Air Force. So he was a fighter pilot in Vietnam and later went on to become an airline pilot. But again, he had that same kind of quiet confidence when he entered a room. And both of them had a respect between each other. So my grandfather and my uncle, and again, they didn't sit around telling war stories, even if I asked them, because I had a curiosity about their service. They never really talked about it, but yet there was a respect for one another that I always just attribute to the fact that they had that in common, that they were in the military. So that's where the seed was planted in terms of me having a respect and appreciation for military service. Now, where it switched, where I saw it as a path for myself, was when I was a young adult, was when the Gulf War happened. It was 91, so I was sophomore in high school. And again, not to get into the politics of the Vietnam War, but there was an accepted way to perceive the Vietnam War. And I always felt that while I don't judge people for revisiting American foreign policy or having an opinion about, where in the Cold War we made decisions that in hindsight maybe weren't the best decisions, either nationally or globally. I felt that reflected on veterans of that war. Like the Vietnam veterans didn't get the same respect at the parades that my grandfather did. Like my uncle, has a very different perspective about Vietnam, having raised his hand to go, than what you were seeing in like the Oliver Stone movies. Like this is when Platoon came out, Full Metal Jacket. There was an accepted way to kind of frame the Vietnam War, but I was hearing this different perspective that I wasn't hearing in my social sciences classes in high school, who were being taught by people that were probably in colleges in protest of the war. So, and again, I don't want to derail this whole thing about the Vietnam War, but when the Gulf War happened and it was on CNN every night, I would stay up to watch the briefings because I was so mesmerized by Norman Schwarzkopf and his command of the media and the narrative, and like just his kind of force of presence. That, like, when you're growing up as a kid learning about World War II, you hear about Eisenhower, you hear about Patton, you hear about Bradley, like these are military leaders that are put up on a pedestal in like the military community, and like here's somebody living and breathing like that caliber of leader, and I saw Norman Schwarzkopf on the TV, and I was like, that's who I want to be. Like that's what I want to be when I grow up. And Colin Powell as well, with the Joint Chiefs and in the parades in New York on the tail end of the Gulf War, and then that's when I really saw, I think that's where I want to be. That's who I want to become is like that. And then what kind of sealed it was because I lived close enough to West Point, my soccer team would go up there in the summers for soccer camp. And, I would be in the barracks getting ready to go out to the fields, and we'd go out to the soccer fields to train, and I'd see the cadets marching by, going off to their maneuvers. And then I'm like, this feels right. Like this is my path. And I pursued acceptance to West Point. I was fortunate enough to get a letter of acceptance, and that put me on the path.
Yeah, that's amazing. I really appreciate how you highlight, the family influence and really your environment, right? Influencing your decision. Out of curiosity, you kind of touched on it, but want to kind of ask point blank, did your grandfather ever, tell you stories of his service, or not even?
It's interesting. Like even my mom and my uncles that are still alive to this day, like there's holes in the story,
right?
Because he didn't talk about it. So we know that he was wounded. Mm-hmm. We know that he lost friends in the Pacific, and we know roughly from a diary that he wrote and letters that he wrote to my grandmother, we know generally kind of the sequence of where he was, but yet we don't know what he actually experienced. Like he never talked about it. But it's interesting because he used to babysit us. As he would sit on the couch, and it was interesting. There was a portrait of him in uniform just above their TV and all of his medals. And I picked up on this even when I was a kid. He would sit there watching the news, eating dinner, and he would just kind of stare at that sometimes, like, and like you have to wonder, like I was too young to like understand what was happening to maybe engage him and say, hey, Grandpa, what are you thinking about? But we know this about veterans, right? Is they, in many ways, they kind of quietly suffer because they experience things that other people can never possibly understand, and they don't want to impose that burden on them, so they don't talk about it. So we know he served, and my uncle's the same way. Like I've asked him questions about his service, and he's very humble about it and very vague about the specifics. And I think you talk to especially combat veterans. I mean, I'm not a combat veteran, so I put combat veterans on a whole other pedestal of respect from people who have just been in uniform. But they all have that kind of, they don't talk about their experiences, and I think that's just kind of a known factor. Right.
Yeah, it's interesting you point that out, and it's also part of why I was asking. And it's a big purpose of the show is to bring to light experiences and being proud of service, generally speaking. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Also, out of curiosity, and part of the reason why I asked, childhood and what led you to service, did your peers, like the kids you grew up with in your class, did they also enlist?
Not very many. There wasn't very many people that went into the military out of my community, because this was that turning point, I think, in the United States as a whole, like late 80s into early 90s. Like the economy was starting to churn, like globalization was starting to happen, digitalization was happening. So like a lot of people were going on the college path, and I would say it was almost looked down. I don't want to say looked down upon, but let's just say if given the choice between your kid going to college or going in the military, I think most parents would push their kids to go to the college path. And that's, I mean, to an extent, I kind of get that. But yeah, there wasn't very many people that were choosing the military as a path when I grew up, when that time came. I mean, there were kids that did enlist, but they were few and far between.
Sure. Yeah. So it really was a strong influence from your family in
Yeah, more from my
particular.
family,
So
more so from my family.
yeah, interesting. Okay, awesome. So let's go to in getting into West Point. How was that process for you as an 18-year-old kid? Like, did you have your family supporting you through that application, or were you just doing that point blank?
No, I had a tremendous amount of support from my family. Like they were kind of inspired, I think, by that's what the path I chose for myself. I
Mm.
mean, I know that my certainly my family was very proud of me for going that path. Although I shared this on the construction disruption podcast, which you did a great job on. I saw your recording last week. Like on that podcast, we explored more. The interesting decision I had in high school was art school was as equal an attractive path to me as West Point. And it's like, well, how do you reconcile those two paths? I mean, I don't think you could find two paths that are more divergent. And I chose the service route because it I think it just resonated with me more. And coming from a blue collar family, this notion of contributing to society, the whole American dream, like giving back to the country that embraced our family. The military service felt more of like I don't know, it just felt like the right path. Like it felt like the good thing to do and the right thing to do. And but yeah, I had a lot of support from my community. Like even like the American Legion, I talked about the American Legion. The last parade they had before I went to West Point, they actually made me like they put me in the car in the front and they let me have Memorial Day. They let me give a speech. What do I know at 17 years old about sacrifice and service? But like the veteran community in my town in particular, like definitely kind of embraced me because I think because a lot of kids weren't making that choice.
Right.
So to
Right.
see somebody make that choice, I think they were appreciative of that. I think
Yeah.
respectful.
That's really special. I love to hear that, and it's also encouraging for other kids, I'm sure, who saw you, being put in front of that parade as an inspiration for them. So that's awesome. So walk us through what West Point was like. I know there's lots of dynamics between first year, between summers, and then when you decide your kind of your track.
Yeah, so it was definitely it was definitely a culture shock. So I mean, the first day they hit you over the head hard, and as much as you read about it or think you know about it, you know nothing about the experience until you're in it, and it is a shock. I will tell you. So the probably the two biggest shocking elements of the first day, and I remember it very vividly, is the first thing that they teach you is they limit you to 4 responses. So that whole first summer you're in basic training. It's called cadet basic training. It's a weeding out process. So they're trying to weed out the people that probably aren't going to make it. So there's we called it hazing. I think now they've kind of tampered it a little bit, and as we say amongst the old grads, the Corps has it's not as hard as it was when we were there, but I'm sure it's just as hard. But we call it beast barracks, and it was you're limited to 4 responses, and it's yes, no, no excuse, and I do not understand. And there's a lot of I don't know that I fully appreciated even back then when I was at the academy the power of limiting someone to those 4 responses, but yet I think it's indicative of how the military works. You're either affirming something, denying something, seeking clarification, or taking responsibility and accountability. And I think that fourth one is the most critical. And what they drill into your head that first summer, there's always other circumstances, right? There's always nuance, but on the battlefield, no one has time for that. It's so like the leader has to take accountability, and that is like the foundation of like respect in the military. So they really drive that home that first summer. And I will say initially I didn't struggle with the accountability part, but the intensity of it. So the physical fitness and the marching, and it was just something I'd never experienced before. And I was reasonably active in high school. I played soccer, I played ice hockey, and for the kids listening at home thinking about going the service academy route, I will tell you, follow the at least back then they gave out guidelines for how to train physically to get ready for basic training. And I don't know that I fully paid attention to it because I was like, well, I'm fit. All right, I can run, I can play soccer, I can play ice hockey. No, you don't understand what fitness is until you get into the Army. So I definitely tell anyone going into basic training, service academies, whichever of the 4 that you choose, definitely pay attention to the fitness requirements, because I definitely struggled, not being at the same level of some of my peers who were just like very strong physical specimens. So that first summer and I definitely struggled a little bit, but then I got my footing once the academic year started. So, academics at West Point, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a college like any other, but there's military discipline, there's military units, and you get a sprinkling of military, which I actually quite enjoyed throughout all the course load. So for instance, when you learn world history, you learn world history, but through the lens of wars and combat and how technology changed the battlefield, which I actually found to be a very interesting lens that even serves me well to this day, is like when you see a situation emerging and people are responding very emotionally to it. I feel like people that have gone the military path, because they have to kind of take that broader lens view, because it's just the nature of combat, the nature of warfare. I have a different view than people who maybe haven't served in the military, in terms of like, even take the stuff that's hitting the news today. So West Point really drilled that into you. And also the other expectation your first year is that you have to stay current on current affairs, because current affairs are dictating foreign policy, which could dictate where you end up deploying. So, back then, as I'm sure it's all digital now, but back then they would deliver the New York Times to the door of your barracks room every morning. And by the first formation, you were expected to be able to speak intelligently to all the stories on the front page in terms of what was happening in the world. And this was now early to mid 90s. So the Bosnian Civil War was front page news at this time when I was, and so I basically was reading about the mission that I was going to take on when I graduated and became an officer. And that's what influenced my decision to be stationed in Germany, because that's where the mission was. I felt I felt I was drawn to the Bosnian mission because I understood the significance of how America's role in the world was changing from the fight in the Cold War, which was not going to happen anymore because the Soviet Union collapsed, to now being this force for good, this peacekeeping force to prevent the little flare-ups from becoming global conflict. And I like the idea of serving in an army that wasn't necessarily going to fight the big world war, but was going to deploy to prevent and be a deterrent to broader conflict. And that was anchored in the Balkans at the time. So, but I learned all that from gaining an appreciation for the history of the region and the complexity of the various ethnic factions that are there, and the history going back centuries that fueled that conflict, and Tito and how his leadership kind of set the stage for what would become the Civil War. So you get all that from reading the articles off the New York Times. So having that interest in the context of situations, I think, was something that West Point taught me that has served me well. Because even to this day, like I am hungry. I'm always hungry for the details, the context. Like what's the root cause? What's driving this? I understand that there's something happening, and it's not good, and people are panicking or whatever. But what's behind what's behind all that? And I think having that context, that West Point did a good job of teaching me that. So I mean, I can go on and on. There's so many cool little stories about West Point, but those were the things that jumped out at me as probably the biggest takeaways.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm interested in taking that course. I would take that right now if I could. That sounds really cool. So, I understand that summers at West Point provide opportunity for pretty unique experiences. Do you have any that come top of mind?
I do. So there was one that actually put me on the path that I'm on today. So I was very fortunate to be at West Point at a time where they were starting to offer summer experiences that mimicked more of what you would expect at a civilian college. So the opportunity to do an internship of sorts. Now, they were still military focused, but it was beyond kind of like the usual, you're going to air assault school, or you're going to airborne school, and I got to do actually, I'll tell you two stories. So I was fortunate that I got to have two very cool experiences. So the first was I got to go serve down in Fort Polk, Louisiana, and serve on the opposition force down there. So you're probably familiar with the different maneuver training centers that the U.S. Army has, spread throughout the world, and it's where they send units to get tested. And Fort Polk came into being during the Vietnam War because the vegetation and other kind of geographic aspects of it kind of mimicked what the soldiers were going to see in Vietnam. So it became kind of a training ground to get soldiers ready for Vietnam. And so they still maintain it as like a jungle fighting kind of environment. So there's an opposition force, And it's like playing. It was like as a I don't know, I was like 19 years old. It was like playing laser tag for the summer. I mean, we wore what was called miles gear, which is like the Army's version of laser tag, so you could hit other people and they know if you got hit. But they gave me black kind of like communist guerrilla, BDUs. So it was like jet, toe to ceiling, or head to toe black BDUs, and didn't have to wear a helmet because we were in insurgency. And I got to play insurgency for the summer, harassing the National Guard units that were coming through for their rotation. So like that. So that was like such a cool experience.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was the 509th was the name of the unit. Their kind of motto was Geronimo. I have the patch somewhere, but that was like a really cool experience. But the experience that put me on the path I'm on now is I got to go down to Orlando and work for Stricom, which was part of like the R&D side of the Army, and what they were doing was outfitting. So the miles gear, the laser scat tag I just told you about, they were outfitting it for different vehicles so that they could introduce vehicles into training combat scenarios. So the kit that I was helping implement was for the Kiowa Warrior, which you're probably familiar with. The Kiowa, it's a reconnaissance, so very light helicopter, but it's also armed and can come flying in and strafe areas as needed. So they were trying to figure out how to replicate its battlefield capabilities for training. So it was mounting lasers on the gun mounts so that it would fire, but then also if it's receiving fire, if it knew it got hit. But the problem is the thing moves so fast, the ability of the technology to kind of register hits. So I spent a summer going back and forth between Orlando and Fort Hood testing miles gear on the Kiowa Warrior, which meant I was capturing data and doing hard engineering, but I also got to ride around in the Kiowa and go up and test it, which was kind of cool. So like a very atypical West Point experience, but it was something they were starting to introduce at the time. And as we get to it later in the story, I mean, that's what ultimately led me to Boeing. Was I liked the idea of working in technology, but working in technology in a way that was of service to the nation and directly to the military. And that seed was planted through that experience through the Department of Systems Engineering that I was in at West Point.
That's awesome. That as you put it, right, awesome experiences, pretty unique. I don't know how else you get to do something like that. No. So really cool. At what point in your degree there at West Point did you decide your, I want to say track, but specialty, I guess I'll call it?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that I had and this has like been a trend throughout my entire career. I had a very good. So every student is given a mentor, like an academic advisor, to help them kind of pick their major. And her name was Kiki Michele. She was my instructor, and she noticed that I was more interested in being broader than deep in an area. Like she saw that I had a capacity for systems thinking, and I wasn't necessarily passionate about any one piece of engineering, but I was interested in data, and I was interested in analytics, and I was interested in building software. And West Point had just developed a new program called it engineering management, which was really kind of a disservice to the what the degree actually was. But it was this salad bar of all these different principles that are actually like the cornerstones of AI and data analytics and cloud computing and all the things that we're dealing with today. It was basically what was a technology versatile back in the day. And she sold me on this idea of like, you can do all these things. You can learn how to code. You can learn how to work with data. You can learn how to use data to make decisions. And for my degree, there was a capstone project to put all these things into practice. And my project was to optimize the recycling routes for the base. So that meant like doing nodal diagrams of where the recycling center was relative to all the different pickup points and optimizing routes and collecting a lot of data to see how you can improve that. Like, this is the current state of cost and time and whatever it takes to deliver the service. How would you optimizing it against a systems of equations using lots of data. And that, those are skills that have paid dividends throughout my entire career that I am so eternally grateful to her that she even got me interested in that, because it was a little known degree program at the time. It was kind of still in its infancy. But it was amazing. Like, it was just, I can't say enough great things about the Department of Systems Engineering and civil engineering, because I did my track in civil engineering, because I I was fascinated in bridges because I knew I was going to be a combat engineer. And I mean, if you know the history of combat engineers, I mean, there's so many storied examples of bridges even being built or blown up. And I was just kind of fascinated by that as the mission, like bridging as a combat mission. So I said, well, if I'm going to go bridging as my kind of specialty as an officer, I should know what holds them up. So I chose structural engineering as my engineering focus. So
awesome. So is that like a major and a minor in terms of degrees?
yeah. So at the time, I don't know if it's still the case now, but at the time, every West Point cadet, regardless of what they chose as a major, had to do. They called it a track. It wasn't a true minor, but you had to do like an engineering sequence. They called it in a traditional engineering. So even if you were a history major, you had to take engineering courses. And I think the idea behind that is there's something to say about the engineering mindset that applies very well to the military world for officers in terms of how they just kind of interpret and react to situations. Like the engineering mindset is very valuable for being an officer. So I think that was the thinking back then, was that every officer that comes out of West Point, regardless of what they major in, has to have that kind of fundamental core and engineering discipline. And that's so that's what drives that, or that's what drove that at the time.
Yeah, that all tracks just from listening. Overall, always amazing to hear about West Point experiences. I think it's an incredible program.
Yeah.
So you're graduating from West Point. I want to know what that feels like and where you go from there.
Yeah, so I mean, like a huge sense of accomplishment. So I had a great 4 years there. I mean, it was like the experience is both fun and crazy, and also serious and challenging. Like you just have this breadth and wealth of experience that you just really can't replicate anywhere else. But coming out of West Point, I knew two things. Was one, I wanted to be where the mission was, which at that time was in Europe, because we were doing peacekeeping operations in the Balkans. And I'd always dreamed of living outside the United States. Like I saw that as kind of one of the thing, like going back to my grandfather and my uncle, I always attributed their worldliness and their kind of calm and demeanor to the fact that they had been outside the United States and had seen things outside of the United States. And I was like, well, that's something that I should do. And it was either Germany or Korea at the time were the two destinations. And I liked the idea of drinking beer in Germany over going to Korea. And the mission was in Germany. So that was the other driver, because pretty much if you went to Germany, you were going to the Balkans in some capacity. So, so I chose Germany, of course. And this is like where my military story, it's like kind of a series of interesting events. So I was originally slated to go to a unit that was imminently going to deploy to Bosnia. Like I was going to get there, and then like a month later, we were going to ship off. And I got redirected at the last minute, and I still don't know why, to a unit that had just come back from Bosnia. So I went to Officer Basic in St. Louis, which you'll appreciate, which is Fort Leonard Wood is not far from you. And then I show up in Germany right before Christmas. So my first Christmas away from my family, and nobody's there. Like all the officers are gone because they just got back from a 6 month. I know, maybe more than 6 months, might have been a year, but they had all just gotten back from Bosnia. They had done their rotation, and so they were all on vacation or taking leave. And so I showed up at the unit, and I was the first lieutenant of the new batch. And then they all started to come back, and I was the only new lieutenant. And as you can appreciate, the new guy gets a little bit of crap from the guys that have been around, but I made lifelong friendships in that unit. There was something very special. It was the 82nd Engineer Battalion, where Blue Babe was our motto. Literally the Paul Bunyan's ox was our logo. We had to paint we had this kind of like satanic looking head, blue bull head painted on all our vehicles and stuff like that. Was like, and there was like a camaraderie, as you can appreciate. Different units have like a certain personality or camaraderie or thing about them that kind of unifies them. And there was just something very special about this group of officers. Like to this, like, so we get together every year. We call it the 10-liter challenge. So it was a tradition that started in Germany. I was a part of the first one, where basically the goal was to drink 10 liters of beer in one day. I mean, this is the thing you do when you're in the army and you're in your 20s and you're stationed in Germany. Like you come up with these great ideas. So it was a tradition that started, and we have kept it up. So even though all the officers of that in that time, in that moment, have spread throughout the world, like we're everywhere. Like none of us are like in the same location, but like every year, most of us make the time and we choose a different city every year, and we come together. Now our families are involved in instead of 10 liters, it's more like the 1 liter challenge, but in terms of the amount of beer we're drinking. But like just like the greatest group of guys and like the like lifelong friends. I mean, they're my brothers in ways that other people will never understand.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a closeness that I have to them. But like, so what creates that camaraderie? And I think what it is the commonality of experiences, because we were, in the Army, you're only really together with your unit for very short durations, like 18 months to 2 years. So the overlap between that, like with those people, was very short in terms of how much time they physically spent in my life. But yet the bonds that were created last a lifetime. So I have nothing but fond memories of my time in Germany as a platoon leader. And again, even though I never deployed in combat, and as fortune would have it, so this is a funny story. So things started to heat up in Kosovo. And initially, when things started to heat up in Kosovo, so the mission in Bosnia was largely stable. Like, we had a presence through the peacekeeping force where there wasn't going to be a flare up there. Like, that situation was largely kind of put to rest. But now things started to, there was an insurgency of, an Albanian insurgency in Kosovo seeking independence. The Serbs were coming in because they were still kind of asserting control over that area. There was violence. It was like, great, and here we go again. Like Europe really couldn't stomach another civil war in the region. So we thought we were going in as a combat mission. So our unit was sent to the field. Like, we were intensely training for our combat mission. Like, we thought we were going in to push the Serbs out. And then, the United States decided to, we had a bombing campaign. You probably remember, if you're old enough, we bombed Belgrade. And then Milosevic kind of pulled back, and it became a peacekeeping mission. So our unit, the thought was that we were so sharpened as a spear to go into combat that we weren't, like, probably not the best unit to send in now for a peacekeeping mission, because we were in that kind of mindset of combat mission. So they sent us back into the field to train for an inevitable subsequent peacekeeping rotation, but they actually sent another unit. And then I got picked up to be a general's aide when we got out of the field for the combat training. So then I moved to a different city to be an aide de camp to a 1-star general, which was another like absolutely like life-changing kind of educational experience. But it unfortunately, it did deprive me of the opportunity to deploy with my unit, which is like, if I could go back, as much as like career-wise, it was a good decision for me to go and do the staff position. Like, I do regret not deploying with my unit. Like, that's kind of still stings to this day. Like, I have a lot of regrets about that. Like, I felt like, to get to that point where like you train for it, like, this is what you've been training for your whole military career. You want to see if you can stand up, like if you can actually meet the standard. Like, can you achieve just that level of performance or leadership when actually put to the test. And so I was never put to that test, but yet I saw things at the staff level that probably was more kind of developed. Like, if I'm being selfish about it, like, more developmental than going and sitting on a base camp for 6 months or a year. So
yeah, I totally hear you. I want to put a pin in that, take a step back and track back into where we just paused. So graduating from West Point, you get assigned to St. Louis to meet with your unit that is returning from a rotation. What happens from there, like, in terms of chronological order, I guess, from that point until deploying to Germany?
Yeah. So actually, I met my unit in Germany. So I went. I should have clarified that. So I went to St. Louis for Officer Basic. That's where the home of the engineer. So every engineering officer, regardless of where they get their commission, goes through St. Louis for an additional 6 months of training specific to their branch, and then you go to your unit. So I went. So Germany was when I actually moved to my first unit, which was the 82nd Engineers, and I was fortunate because I was one of the first lieutenants that I also got a platoon leader assignment right away, because this was also a downsizing army. So the army was rapidly downsizing. The queues for leadership positions were actually longer than the number of slots that were available. So a lot of people would show up at a unit and wait months and months and months to get their platoon leader position, and many would move into the position and get moved out very quickly to make room for the next person. So being the first in my unit played to my benefit, because I got to sit in I got a platoon right away, and I got to sit in the position longer than people that came in behind me later. So but the downside of it was I took over a platoon that was a very well-oiled machine. So this was a unit that had just come from the field. So now I'm a fresh lieutenant out of school. Like, what do I know? They've just deployed and done a real mission. So what can I possibly teach them? And the platoon leader that I took over from was probably one of the most squared away lieutenants in our entire battalion. His name is John Keane. He lives in Texas and he now works for Dell. Another very good friend of mine. But even though we don't really see each other all that often, like another lifelong friend. But like such a squared away guy. Like, I mean, like just an incredible leader, an incredible platoon leader. Now I'm taking over his platoon. And like they had camaraderie, they had high level of performance. Like the NCOs were all, the squad leaders and the platoon sergeant were all incredible. There wasn't much that I could really add to the equation, but I learned a very valuable lesson by just listening to my NCOs. And I think that like if I can give one piece of advice to any officer going into a platoon is and this it actually kind of tracks for construction as well. We can revisit this later. Is as they say in Game of Thrones, like, you know nothing, Jon Snow, right? Like you're an officer and you're expected to perform a function, but your NCOs have the expertise, and you could do one of two things. You can, try to pull rank and think you know things, and you're going to fail, or you could take the time to get to know your NCOs and listen. And I was very fortunate that my platoon sergeant, his name was Sergeant Snarison, like he was single, and so this guy was like, what a character this guy was. So he in our barracks. He took over the whole like attic of the barracks and made it his personal pad. And like when we were done on a Friday night, he would invite me up to his apartment and he would just teach me the ropes. And I learned more about the Army and like what it takes to lead by just listening to him and listening to my squad leaders and my team leaders. And then, like that's something I put into practice to this day. And like I have a funny story of something that happened in that first 3 months. That I did because I listened to what he said. Like he said, you should never ask your soldiers to do something that you aren't willing to do yourself. And because we were a mechanized battalion, we had track units. We had 113s. Now, the 113 was a Vietnam era piece of equipment. So like the engineers always get the hand-me-downs, right? So these used to be infantry carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. Well, the infantry now had Bradleys and Abram tanks, so we get the hand-me-downs. So we had these 113s, and they would just break down constantly. So our routine from week to week was every Thursday we would go out into our local training area to train. So we would take the vehicles out and train, and we would inevitably break them. But on Monday we had inspections. Everyone was in the motor pool, and you inspected all of your vehicles. And combat readiness was a very important metric. So if any of your tracks were reported as down, like that was a problem for your commander. And for the unit, if you had too many tracks that were down. So what it inevitably meant happening was Friday you were scrounging for parts, and some poor sucker was stuck repairing the vehicle on a Friday night. So it wasn't a question of when that was happening, it was just if. So we were out at the local training area. One of the tracks went down. We limped it back to the motor pool. We couldn't get the parts till late on a Friday afternoon, and I knew that my guys were going to get stuck repairing the vehicle on a Friday night. Now, the problem was the barracks were right adjacent to the motor pool. So what would happen is the people who were going out drinking to go downtown, they'd walk by the motor pool and they'd kind of talk smack to the guys that were stuck on the motor pool working. So that night I'm like, no one expected an officer to do this, but I'm like, they're going to do a repair on the vehicle. I want to know how it works, and I'm going to stay with them and do it. So one of my soldiers said, sir, we're going to get dirty. Put on these coveralls. I still have them actually. It was like a tanker's set of coveralls. It had no rank, no name, no insignia, nothing. But it was something that you could wear that was flame retardant, and you can get greasy and dirty. So we were replacing the pads on the track, which means you have to take apart the whole track, and someone has to get under the vehicle, and you're pushing pins to take the track. So I said, show me how to do it, and they showed me how to do it. So I'm under the track, and I'm helping with the pinning, and then all of a sudden I hear this voice. Like kind of adjacent to like where my guys were standing, and they were talking to somebody. I didn't know who it was, and then someone kicks my boot, and I'm like, all right, who's kicking? And they kicked it hard, and he said, who is that under there? Come out from under there. So I come out from under there, and I stand up, and it's the battalion command sergeant major. Now I'm new to the unit, so I'm not wearing any insignia, so he didn't know I was an officer, and I'm not going to pull rank on a sergeant major, right? So he's kind of undressing me and kind of but in a playful way, right? It's like he knows that this is what we have to do to keep the battalion going. He doesn't want to see people working late on a Friday night, but he also is respecting the fact that the soldiers are doing it. And then he realized who I was. He recognized me all of a sudden, and he smiled at me. He goes, "Blue babe, sir." And then he walked away. So it was like in that moment, it was like that's how you kind of gain the respect of the NCOs. And I'll never like forget that moment, because it taught me a very valuable lesson, and like which kind of applies to construction today. It's like to gain the respect of the people in the field, you got to be willing to get your hands dirty. You got to be willing to go out there. Like if you like, I think there's, and I don't say I encountered many officers like this, but there was some officers that felt that their role was to sit in the office and do paperwork and more of a white collar job. But if you want to be successful as an officer, especially if you're in a combat unit, like you got to get out there and do what your soldiers are willing to do. So that was I thought that was a fun story to tell.
That's a great story, man. I really appreciate you sharing that. And also I appreciate the plug there for, really translatable skill, which is something we'll touch on later on in the show and the recording. But that's an awesome story. So I would imagine after that point, you probably felt more integrated with your team.
Oh yeah. I had a great platoon. We used to do, I had an apartment right off base. Like I'd have them over my house. I like to cook, and I'd have them over sometimes, just a squad at the time. Other times I'd have the whole platoon over, and I had this little tiny backyard and this little tiny grill, but I'd cook but there's a line that's very subtle that you can't cross. Like in gaining the respect of your soldiers, you also can't become their friend, because the reality is if you God forbid you ever have to deploy to combat and you have to make a hard decision, you can't have a relationship with any of the soldiers to the extent that it jeopardizes your ability to make a hard decision, which could put them at risk. So there's a very fine line between gaining the respect of your soldiers and trying to be your friends. And when you're young, you want to be liked. So, as a young officer, I can't say that I always stayed on the right side of that line, but there was a line of like you wanted to be one of them, but you couldn't get too familiar with them. And that was, but you learned from there were other officers. Like one of my good friends, Andy Kogar, was really good at this. James Lockridge was another guy in our unit that was really good at this. Dan Hurley, like I can go on and on. There was a lot of other officers that were around me that knew how to strike that balance well. And I would just kind of watch them and say, even the guy I took over from John Kane, it's like, okay, so what are they doing that allows them to maintain the respect and authority of an officer, but also being relatable to the soldiers? And I probably learned more about leadership from those guys than I ever learned at West Point. because they're putting it into practice, and Totally. They were very well respected officers in our unit. So, Totally. But I will say something else, like the tone, and I think also where I gained an appreciation for how upper leadership sets the tone for the rest of the organization. So our battalion commander, his name was Dwayne Kopinski, like to this day, like one of the most amazing leaders I've ever worked for, because I have never seen a leader that was able to balance that. Like he was hardcore, and he gained the respect from the soldiers. Like he could do the push-ups, he could do the runs. Like he was like physically and mentally, he was a soldier. Like he was a soldier, but he was a fun guy too. Like he was like what a fun leader to get an opportunity to work for. And he would test us as officers. Like he would do these things. Like we would do these staff rides where we would go to battlefields. Like we went to Verdun, and we went to a couple other of the battlefields from World War II that our unit actually fought in, like to kind of understand the history of our unit. So he was like really big on that, like the heritage and the history to build camaraderie. But then he would also put us through these training things that were just a total, like a total kind of hazing experience. Like he would take us out to the field and march us around for 2 days and not feed us, and then finally, when it was time to get a meal, they'd bring out a bunch of live chickens that we'd have to butcher and prepare ourselves. Like the first thing we've eaten in like 2 days. So, like he did like a lot of that stuff to build camaraderie and like test our mettle. And it was, and like we would do it in the winter, like when it was freezing out. So like just physically miserable experiences, but yet probably some of my fondest memories. And like, that was his leadership. So
yeah, that's, I always find that in that specific moment of, going through those hardships, obviously that's miserable and sucks. In the end of the day, like, as you just said, right, those end up being some amazing experiences to look back on and to reminisce on and learn from. So that's cool. So between, I guess, that stage of what you're just describing to switching your role, right, we're working alongside that general. Anything else happen in that period of time?
Yeah, so I was fortunate in that I got to do 2 platoon leader assignments. So I was initially a combat platoon leader, which means I had a combat mission. But then I was made the support platoon leader. So I was responsible for the logistics for the battalion. So when we were ramping up to deploy to Kosovo, they sent me for training on like what does it take to move an entire battalion to the Balkans. Fuel, ammunition, logistics, loading vehicles on the trains. Like there was how to like to secure them so that they don't fall off. Like the amount of training I got around like the complexity of supply chains.
Yeah.
Like that, like I learned a lot just being in that role that is very applicable to my role today, is just understanding the complexity of like planning like very sophisticated moving of equipment and people and personnel and things. Like when do you ever get a chance to do that at that scale at that young of an age? So that was a pretty awesome opportunity too.
Yeah, that is awesome. I think it's a little bit underrated too when you think about military experiences and just migrating, equipment, people, food, everything that's involved. And then from your perspective, even more so to be, essentially in charge of that at scale. I can only imagine how applicable it is moving forward. Awesome. So now you got this new role that comes up. Kind of how did that happen, and how did you make that switch?
So our unit had to send an officer's tribute to interview for the position. So the general sent out a message to all the engineering units, basically, where I send an officer to interview for this position, and I'll make my selection. So it was one of those things where you never want to leave your unit, and like we had such great camaraderie in the unit. I didn't want to interview, but I was sent, and I also saw the opportunity that it presented. So I'm like, I'm not going to throw the interview. Which some people suggested I do. They're like if you go in and you do well, you're going to get picked. So you should just throw the interview. And I didn't want to do that. As much as I wanted to stay with my unit, I saw that this was an opportunity because I actually had a 20-year plan to stay in the military. Like I wasn't planning to get out. Like I was going to be a lifer, and like being a staffer for a 1-star general was opens doors, especially in a downsizing army, you think it's going to open doors. So I moved to headquarters, United States Army Europe. So not quite the Pentagon, but comparable. There's a 5-star general that runs it. So the 1-star that I worked for was on his staff. And what I learned in that role actually applies very much to how I'm thinking about AI today. So if I think about what my role was for him, in many ways, I was a bot. I was a bot that he was dealing with all this unstructured data that resided in all these different systems. There was no magic button you could push to aggregate it. He didn't have time to pull it. He didn't even know necessarily where it resided. So he needed a bot that was smart enough to go and build processes and automations to go pull that data from all the different places, and then on a daily basis, give him an executive summary so that he can make decisions. So I mean, in many ways, like that's I think where AI. Like I would love to have, now that I'm in an executive role, like I would love to have a chief of staff.
Yeah.
There's not enough budget for me to have. But AI bots could easily do that. I mean, not to minimize what I did back then, but that's what it was really about was processing unstructured data and summarizing it in a way, and then also being prompted, right? So I was only as effective as what the general prompted me to do, much like an AI engine. So when, like if he gave me effective prompts on what he needed, then I can go find it. And then I learned over time, based off of feedback from him, like what's the best way to present or organize or structure the data for him, or how to get more efficient about pulling data from, okay, so I can automate that. Or, okay, so like an example of that is I had to get a report from all the different bases spread throughout Europe on the status of the housing for the families in terms of their level of maintenance and stuff. And it all lived in different spreadsheets. And back then we didn't have the cloud and ways to aggregate that, but I was able through Outlook and working through relationships with the local leaders that manage that scope to automate, or to the extent that I could back then, them sending me a report of the data structured in a way to simplify my ability to aggregate it. And like you learn how to do those things, right? So it was an intense assignment. The hours were long, but I also got to go with him because he was a 1-star, and because the Balkans was his theater. So while I never deployed to Bosnia, I was there. We would go to Bosnia and Kosovo, pretty much once a quarter. I think sometimes even more frequently. It was almost every other month, but not quite. So I got to see. So like if you deploy, on a peacekeeping mission, there's especially that mission, it was quite possible that you got stuck behind the wire on a base camp for 6 months and never really got outside the wire. So I mean, and some of my friends that deployed, like they never got outside the wire, and because it was a general, like he got to go where he wanted to. So I saw things that I never would have seen had I not deployed. I mean, we would land on the airfield and we would jump in a Black Hawk and we would just hop around the Balkans. So I mean, and like the thing that probably the two things that experiences that I had that kind of, actually three, that stood out from that was, so one, I got to go to Sarajevo, and our local interpreter gave us a tour of the city, and I got to go see a lot of people don't know this, but the Winter Olympics were held in Sarajevo. So there's all these Olympic facilities throughout the city, up in the mountains and around the city. Well, that was the front lines of the war. So you go and you tour these and like the juxtaposition of the contrast of like, these were buildings that were built with the intent of sponsoring the Olympics, which is supposed to bring the world together, and yet it's riddled with where are you going to see that? I mean, it was pictures from when I was a kid. It was like you saw pictures of World War II of like European cities being devastated, but here it is. I'm surrounded by it. Buildings that are crumbled, that got hit with artillery. Buildings that were like on the front lines where you could see like shots were exchanged, and like the fronts of them are like Swiss cheese with bullet holes. Going to rooms where some of the worst atrocities of the Civil War happened to the civilian population. And when you stand in a room where there were civilians, people were massacred, like innocent people were just massacred and killed. I can't describe it, but there's a feeling in that room. It just hits you like this is what humanity, this is why I'm here, right? Like this is what humanity is capable of doing to each other, if not left in check. And when we had actually, because we were stationed in Germany, because that they knew that most of us were going to get, like, how do you go from being coddled in America and living a very sheltered life to getting exposed to something like that? Like that's pretty traumatic. So they actually they didn't, it wasn't like part of the training, but it was highly encouraged to go to the concentration camps in Germany, which I think you obviously appreciate, given your heritage, to understand this is what you're going to see. And I remember going to the concentration camp in Dachau and standing in one of the gas chambers and being like this is why I'm serving, right? To prevent something like this from happening again. So so to go to Sarajevo and see that, it was like it left it changed my view of the world. Like it really changed. Like this is what humanity is capable of. And as much as we say it, like never again, right? Like the mantra after World War II, like we're never going to let this happen again. But yet here we are, 40 years later, and it's happening again. Yep. And you read the headlines today, and it's happening again. So it's it changes your view of the world. So getting to do that with him, kind of gave me a worldview that applying it to like my corporate function now, it changes how I respond to, I would say, stressful situations. So it's like, so something's happening at work and people are like upset and they're, this is the end of the world. And I'm like, in the back of my mind, it was like when COVID-19 hit and everyone was like stressing out, I almost felt guilty that I wasn't panicked, because I was like, like, you really have no idea like what's out there and how bad the world can be. And I know that might sound a little bit arrogant or naive, but that was because of that experience. And then the other experience I got to have with him, which really changed my outlook on the world, was through the State Department. America was building medical facilities in Africa, and we were building HIV clinics in Botswana because of the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And they had a ribbon cutting ceremony to open up one of the hospitals. So my general got picked up to be there for the photo op, and I got to go with him. So we went to Botswana, and I met the president of Botswana, and they gave us this like red carpet treatment because we were Americans there for the ribbon cutting. But there was a couple of things that really kind of shocked me in that experience. So one is seeing poverty at that level, like to truly see like the developed world and what that is like, and like the conditions that other people in other parts of the world that we can't even appreciate in the United, like really gave me an appreciation for living in the United States and having the upbringing and the opportunities that I had, just seeing that. But there was a conversation I had with a Botswanan soldier that I will never forget. So they took us to a wildlife preserve, and they had all manners of wildlife. Like poaching was a big problem, so they had these wildlife preserves. And he pulled out a poisonous snake, like a lethal poisonous snake, and he had it on a stick, and he was toying with it like it was a cat. Like no real kind of. I have a picture of him doing it too in my photo album. I took a picture of him, and it was like no real concern for his own well being. And they put the snake away, and then the general went off with like some dignitaries, and I was behind with the soldiers, and I asked him, I said, how could you do that? Like, aren't you afraid you're going to get bit? And he said to me, he's like, I'm not going to live past the age of 40 anyway. So what does it matter? And like that blew me away. Like that, just that kind of like nonchalant kind of like sense of their own mortality, like very different than like how we think about kind of life and the sanctity of human life in like the United States. Like very eye opening. Like at a young age to kind of see the world through that lens was just like, I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity, but it definitely kind of changed my perception of a lot of things.
Yeah, those are really powerful experiences, and I totally hear you in terms of leaving your team at that time. But I also hear you in the sense that that was an opportunity you couldn't deny if it fell on your plate, and it did. So sounds like that was a really impactful experience. Hence your ability to kind of repeat what you went through. So at what point? I'm guessing that was your last rotation.
Yeah, that was my last position in the Army.
So at what point did you realize, okay, I'm going to finish this rotation and I'm going to finish my service as well?
It was a myriad of factors, and I revisit this time in my life just because the world changed very. Like I was in the middle of making that decision when 9/11 happened, and the world drastically changed after 9/11. And I reflect on this decision often. Sometimes I'm glad I made the decision I did. Other times I feel guilty because I have classmates from West Point that stayed in the Army at this time, or once the stop loss was put in place and people couldn't get out, deployed, and some of them didn't come home. So that's a kind of a sombering thing to know that people that I know, some that I knew well, they faced that. They faced the mission bravely. Like they served as they volunteered to do, and went willingly and didn't come back. And the sacrifice that not only for them but their families. So I sometimes revisit my decision to get out because like things were changing around me after I'd made the decision. But what prompted the decision to get out was the Army was rapidly downsizing, and I had kind of charted a path to go back to West Point and teach, and then I was going to go into the R&D side of the Army and kind of do what I was doing from my internship in the Army, and that path was essentially closed because the Army was downsizing, and another path was offered to me that wasn't as good as the path I had charted for myself, which was I was fortunate to get accepted to MIT, and I had to make a very hard decision. I wanted to go to MIT as a uniformed officer and then go back to West Point and teach on the tail end of that and continue. But for a variety of reasons, that door was shut, and I had to make a hard decision. This is like what makes it why I revisit the decision. So I was literally in the final phases of getting out of the Army and also going through the final process for getting accepted to MIT. And I was in New York 2 days before 9/11. So I was like literally down on Wall Street interviewing with a alum of the MIT program that I ended up going to, who was also a Naval Academy grad. So he was like the final approval for me to get into the program. And I had that interview. And on the evening of 9/10, I was on a red-eye flight from Newark back to Germany. And then I vividly remember that evening because there was a bad storm. There was a bad rainstorm. And my flight was delayed. And I took off and I flew over Manhattan and I flew over the Twin Towers, and there was just like this ominous kind of red glow in the sky, which sometimes happens at sunset, after a storm, because all the the moisture in the air and whatnot. And I red eye flight, I fell asleep, and I landed in Germany, and I'm walking through the terminal, and everyone is gathered around all the monitors, and I look up at the monitors, and Twin Towers are on fire. So I was in the air when 9/11 happened, and I landed and I checked in at there was a desk for American soldiers at Frankfurt Airport, and I checked in, and like they were responding to, like we didn't know what was going on at that point, or we suspected it was attack, and then I had to check in, back at the base, and they kept us on the base until they kind of knew what was going on, and they figured out like the security protocols, because we weren't sure if there was going to be subsequent terrorist attacks against American interests in Germany. Like it was kind of a very scary time. So it was like, so now we're at war, right? We're like now we have an enemy, we're at war, but yet I've already started the process to get out. And it was a very kind of surreal time to be in the Army, because the Army still continued to downsize. Like the mission was in Afghanistan, but the initial mission in Afghanistan went like remarkably well, right? We defeated the Taliban using a coalition of local forces. It was mostly like a special operations mission, so they weren't even deploying regular Army units. It was mostly like the special operations guys and like the Ranger battalions and like the more specialized units. So they were still like pushing officers out the door. Like they weren't keeping anyone in. Like they were like, all right, like okay, we're at war, but it's done. Like we won. So okay, back to business. Like let's keep pushing people out. So I didn't really see like the mission felt like it was pretty much under control, and they were still downsizing. And I was like, okay, so I guess I had a good run, and I'm gonna continue on the path. And then when I was in grad school was when the war in Iraq started, and then I was very conflicted because I was now in Cambridge, at MIT, and as if you think back to that within the student populations, there was lots of protesting against the war, and that was very conflicting to be at school, like literally now that the nation is truly marching to war, and I'm a civilian, and like people that had decided to wait it out, that were on the fence. Like I made the decision. There was like some of my peers were on the fence, and then the stop loss hit, and then they couldn't get out. So I'm like, so yeah. So I mean, I that was kind of what was going on when I made the decision to get out, and I still, like I said, it wasn't an easy decision, and I wrestle with it because of what else was going on in the world at the time.
Yeah, man. I mean, hindsight's always makes things more confusing than they need to be. Exactly to your point, I'm really glad that you really dug in and gave that full kind of context of what was actually happening in that moment when you made that decision. And if you didn't say it, I was going to say it, right? Because I also knew that the reality is in that exact moment, the operation was specialized. It was small. It actually ended very quickly, and then only what came thereafter ensued. Continuation of war in different country even, right? So for whatever it's worth, I mean, in your position, you had that opportunity come up. Military was downsizing literally. So what would have been the point from your perspective in that moment to even stay? Very valid, man. Very valid. So sounds like you finished up, you went to MIT for grad school. Interesting that you said, that experience in terms of protests on campus. I mean, it seems like it's a never ending circumstance with, anti-war, anti-military protests on campus, generally speaking. What was that experience like for you? I mean, you touched on it a little bit. How did you kind of get through that mentally?
It was, so, I mean, it was an adjustment. So, I mean, it was, like, I felt like definitely, like, I think you were going to ask later, like things you would have changed about the transition. So I'll touch on that now just because it's kind of applicable to this part of the story. I wish I had gone into a civilian job before going right into grad school, because it was I literally got off a plane. Most of my worldly possessions were being shipped from Germany. I mean, I literally went with my parents to IKEA and bought a futon and a table, and I moved to Boston, and now I'm a student. Like within like 2 weeks of, I technically was still on the rolls when I started at school. I was on terminal leave. So I technically was still in the Army even when I started. And to go right into graduate school was, so now I'm in graduate school, but I don't know what I want to get out of the experience. Like my destination after MIT was going to be to go teach at West Point. Now that I've now diverged, so like, what is my plan? Like, what am I going to do? And one of the things that I experienced like on the tail end when I was interviewing with companies was like, so I got a phenomenal education at MIT. So the program I went to at MIT is a very special program. It's called Leaders for Global Operations. It's a dual degree program. So you get your MBA and a Master of Science. And they have MIT is a very welcome environment for veterans. Like the program that I went to always has at least one military veteran in the cohort. It's very small classes. It's like usually it's like 60 to 70 students. So it's very selective, but they always have like a military person, and I felt my peers in the program respected my service. There was another veteran, Army veteran in my class as well, who was also at West Point. He was a year ahead of me. So there was there was a respect towards veterans, and even during the leadership, there was a lot of classes on leadership, and he and I were often called upon to share our perspective, and that perspective was very welcome. But then in some of the other classes, especially the ones that were more kind of, I would say, political slanted, or were more about debating things, as I also saw how different my worldview was for people who hadn't served, because it was very fashionable within certain circles to protest the war in Iraq, and not to get into the politics of it, but I was very conflicted about that, because while I questioned the rationale for the mission, which I didn't feel good about, like, who am I to even question it? But yet I did question it. But I also didn't like the tone, going back to like when I was a kid, like in talking to my uncle about how the public perceptions and attitudes toward the Vietnam War did reflect on how the veterans were treated. I started to see like a similar dynamic. It's like, so we're protesting the war, which you have a right to do. Like that's what America, I serve to protect their freedom to speak. So to want to shut down the debate is not the right solution, but I don't agree with what they're saying. So I would voice an opposing viewpoint in those classes, and it wasn't always well received, and it wasn't always welcome, but I felt it was necessary, just to provide that perspective. And some of my peers were respected that, others did not. But I think that's, you're kind of seeing that play out in academia now, right? There's like an intolerance, and it's a shame, because like academic institutions are meant to kind of promote critical thinking, and you're right. Seeing people polarizing and not even like, and kind of going back to like what I said about West Point, having that like kind of like the historic, like the broader historical lens and context, is like very few things are black and white. There's always right. there's always kind of nuance, and you have to respect someone else's opinion even if you don't agree with it. And didn't always kind of see that, which was disappointing. But we're having a whole societal debate about that now, right? In academic institutions. So, otherwise it wasn't hard to navigate. I mean, I was, treated, I think I was treated respectfully by the faculty, who got a great education, and it put me on the path that I'm on today. So,
yeah, I mean, you touched on kind of the difficulty that I also, find in the dynamic, which is, of course, everyone can and should have their own opinions, but the issue arises when people don't respect other opinions. So that's unfortunate, and it's important to kind of harp on that for people to realize they need to just respect opinions regardless of what they are. But good to hear that you had an overall good experience. Sounds like an awesome program. From there, how did you get to built environment, finishing MIT and then getting into built environment?
So I took a detour through aerospace. So it was interesting. I wanted to go into construction, and I actually interviewed with a couple of construction companies when I was at MIT, and they didn't know what to do with someone like me. So I didn't have field experience. I had military field experience, but it wasn't construction field experience. And I had this kind of just versatile technologist background, and the construction industry wasn't really thinking about digitalization back then. So there wasn't a role for someone like me in construction. And this was also at a time when the economy, like the what allowed me to come over to construction was when the construction started to go like booming, and to keep pace with the demand. Now there was a need for technology. So that was what allowed me to come over. But out of MIT, there wasn't a path into construction, at least the one that I could find when I was interviewing. But I was fortunate that the program I was at was sponsored by a number of very large blue chip companies, and Boeing was one of them. And they had just won a Army transformation program that was not dissimilar from what I wanted to do as a uniformed officer in the Army, was do R&D. So I'm like, well, now I can do it from the contractor program side, but it's like not very different than the job I would have done had I stayed in the Army. So I like the idea of that. So that's what brought me to Boeing, was being able to go and kind of get back to the Army on the transformation program side. And then when that program dried up, as they do, right, because the mission changes and the focus changed. So it was the program I was on was called Future Combat Systems. So the vision was to transform the Army because it was equipped to fight the Cold War. like World War III scenario. We have to fight in two major theaters, massive tank and armored battle. So that's what we were equipped to do. But now we're doing peacekeeping missions. Now we're fighting asymmetrical wars where the biggest threat is not contact with the enemy, but things like IEDs and things like that. So how do you outfit the military to be more nimble and also simplify the supply chain? So the idea was that the Army was going to coalesce around a common chassis, and there are going to be all these different weapon variants or mission variants on the common chassis to simplify the supply chain. But then the common chassis was going to be augmented by drones and robots to protect soldiers, to prevent civilian casualties. And I like the notion of that we were going to use technology to protect the lives of soldiers and to prevent the mistakes that inevitably happen on the battlefield, like where civilian casualties and collateral damage happen. So the notion of modernizing the Army to be more effective but less lethal in terms of its impact on civilians, and also to make sure more soldiers come home, like that was a noble mission. I was like, okay, I can get behind this. And unfortunately, the funding for the program dried up and it started to come apart. And when the program came apart, I had to find another job at Boeing. And that's when another mentor I want to kind of recognize, her name is Cheryl Braverman. She was in Boeing IT at the time. And she and I connected through just a series of kind of interesting circumstances. And she ultimately brought me onto her team, and that's what put me into enterprise IT, which is what put me on the path to being more of a kind of enterprise technologist, which then created the bridge for me to come to construction when that opportunity presented itself. So that's how ultimately I got back to the built environment, was largely because she gave me that opportunity.
That's awesome. So before we get into kind of what you're focused on today at Skanska, I want to kind of give like an executive summary per se, or just wrap up of that transition period. I know you mentioned, and I think if I heard it correctly in terms of like a recommendation point that you'd make is to have a plan, essentially. Want to give the opportunity for you to, I mean, you can just go ahead and agree with that, or add anything else before we move on, close out that segment.
Yeah, I would say have a plan. I definitely would hesitate going right into academia out of the military. I think there's some value to like getting back into civilian life before you go into an academic environment. And then the last thing I would add is learning how to translate your military experience in ways that civilians understand, because that was a struggle for me when I was interviewing for my first jobs, was the language that we use in the military to describe things doesn't translate, and you have to learn how to translate things. So a couple of examples of that would be like, so you'll say on your resume or in an interview, I led a platoon. Well, nobody knows what that means in terms of day to day, like even basic things like the head count. So I led 30 soldiers and was responsible for their training, health, and welfare. Like now you're putting it in terms that like a civilian can understand. So like that I would say, and there's a lot of resources out there now for veterans to help them do that, but they have to learn how to translate their military experience into terms that civilians understand. And it's things like head count, how organizations function, like the lingo and the jargon of the military just doesn't translate to the civilian world very well.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I agree. I've seen a lot of resources and efforts toward creating those translations. So that's great points. So at Skanska, how's that experience been like? What do you focus on today? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so what brought me to Skanska was I was looking for a values-based company, and kind of similar to why people go into the military is you, at least for me, I need to serve a higher purpose. And what I liked about Skanska is one, so when I was stationed in Germany, I gained I think a real respect for European companies and just how they kind of live their values a little bit better than American companies did, at least how American companies did at the time. And because there was a big emphasis in American companies around shareholder value at the time, and everyone was downsizing and outsourcing and trying to make the quick buck by cutting operational expenses. And I didn't see the European companies really doing that. So I wanted to work for a European company. So Skanska is a Swedish-based construction company, and I just love their values. Their care for life values. Their focus on safety. Their focus on sustainability. Their focus on people. So that's what drew me to Skanska. But the role that I'm in is really a digital transformation and technology enablement role. So what my team does is, it's a very exciting time to be in construction. There's so much disruption in terms of the technology being thrown at our industry, trying to solve some of the just the persistent challenges that we have. I told one of my coworkers in Boston that I will plug his quote as often as I can in podcasts, but I have a coworker in Boston. His name is Mark Moore, and he says construction is an unbroken line from the days of the pyramids, and he's not wrong in terms of the means and methods. Manufacturing went through that transformational moment through the Industrial Revolution, where they went from craft to what we know today, mass production. Construction hasn't had that transformational moment, so we're largely doing things the way we've always done things. But now we have all this technology that's enabling us to maybe be a bit smarter, a bit safer, a bit more productive. So my team is in place because project teams are already overburdened. I think there's a stereotype that in construction we are averse to technology, and that's not true at all. Some of the smartest people I've ever worked with are in construction. So I think construction gets a bad rap in terms of the caliber of the talent that is in the industry, because there are some incredibly brilliant people out on job sites. It's just a different calling, like the Army, like kind of like when I went back to like my high school, where parents were pushing their kids to white collar jobs instead of the Army. Well, I think the same holds true for construction. Is like the trade type work and field type work is looked down upon, but yet it's also a calling. And like I have met people in construction who I would hold up to anyone that I met that went to work for Google or Meta or Amazon or any of those companies. I mean, those companies get the spotlight because they make a ton of money and they're at the forefront of the technology industry. But there's a lot of brilliant people out on our job sites. And like what's cool about my job is I get to find those people who are very busy because they have a different calling in life. Like their passion is to be out in the field, much as my passion was to be in the field as a platoon leader. But now I need to harness that brilliance and drive it towards solutions that we can scale nationally as a company. And it's manifesting itself in a lot of interesting ways. So like it's robotics, it's drones, it's AI, it's laser scanning, it's 360 photography. I mean, there's so many different layers of technology that we're exploring in construction. It's a very dynamic, very exciting world to be in. And so my team basically evaluates those technologies, pilots it, make sure it solves a problem, make sure it delivers value, also make sure it reduces burden. So it's not additive to the burden of our teams out in the field. And then the ones that clearly have a return and deliver value, we scale nationally. Some we recognize are niche, and then we kind of deploy in a more limited capacity. And then there's some that we just say, you know what, that's just not ready for prime time or doesn't really have a place. It's a technology looking for a problem to solve. And we've seen the whole spectrum of it. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What I always say to people when they give the construction is adverse to technology. I always say, they're in the field doing literal manual labor. I mean, who and how would they have time to tinker around with what's going on tech? So that's why it's important to have someone like you in a company to vet the necessities and what's happening, and then provide the solutions rather than having site operators go through that whole process, because it makes no sense, right? How could they? So yeah, that's really cool, man. I'm excited to see what happens, especially with the hardware for the industry. See how that continues to grow. So before we close out the professional section of the show, I want to give the opportunity to highlight translatable skills, right? Military to civilian to profession. I know you touched on a few as we went through your story, but give an opportunity to plug in kind of executive summary there.
So I would say like mission planning and risk management. So in the military, there's a clarity of purpose in terms of the mission. Like we would call that commander's intent. So there was I think in the Army or all the branches of the military, like the thought process of anticipating the risk so that you can react to the risk is an incredibly powerful skill set. And I don't know that I fully appreciated this when I was in the Army, because a lot of the training was very repetitive and very mundane. Like you would get very proficient at the most mundane of tasks and commit those to muscle memory. And it's like, okay, why are we training over and over and over again how to put on the gas mask? Or why are we training over and over and over again on how to clear the weapon? Like I know how to do that, but why am I doing that repetitively to get to a level of proficiency that almost seems to be overkill? And you don't gain an appreciation of that until things go sideways, and why that's so important. What's the saying is like, the plan changes the moment you start to implement it. I mean, the minute you embark on the mission, you can't control how the enemy is going to make contact with you. So if you are struggling with the fundamentals, the things that you can control, you're not going to be able to react to the unpredictable. So I gained a real appreciation in the military for the importance of creating discipline and structure around the things that you can control. So that way, when things are happening, you're in a position to you're not in panic mode trying to handle the simple things. Like those things just automatically happen because you're conditioned. You're not thinking about how to react. You're able to react more effectively. So I think the military conditions people's minds in a way that they don't appreciate, but yet it's so powerful. Like that's a very unique skill that I think you only really get out of the military, is that kind of foresight around execution and reacting to risk and issues as they emerge, and still being able to like lead an organization to navigate those waters. I think is very important.
Yeah, well said, man. I absolutely agree. Critical. Awesome. So before we close out the show, last two questions. We'll start with wellness practice. What does that look like for you?
I mean, things that I learned in the military. I mean, it's like fitness is a big part of my routine to this day. So I mean, I still play soccer. I still do PT. The Army gave me an appreciation, I think, for a level of intensity. Like I've still yet to find something that matches the intensity of just like PT in the military. I mean, like that was just, I think, a whole other level. But I like the variety and the intensity of that. So like ruck marching, I translate to hiking, like the things in the military that you can only experience as you get, like even just putting like 80 pounds on your back and going for a walk. Like I miss some of that. So I try to replicate some of those physical experiences, because I found like the mental challenge of having to take that on was as rewarding as the fitness you got out of it itself. So that's well, this music is a big part of my wellness routine. So I listen to a lot of music. Like I said this on the other podcast I did. Like I have albums or bands that I listen to that put me in a certain mental space. Like if I want to be creative and ideate, I'll put on Pink Floyd. If I'm feeling a little bit like stressful or tense, I'll put on Typo Negative. If I want to feel happy, I put on Queen. Like I have like different bands and albums that. So that's my wellness routine.
Yeah, I totally understand, man. That's awesome, and I really like how you basically translated military PT to civilian life, right? Like rucking versus hiking. Yeah, so that's a cool way to put it. I absolutely agree. Awesome. So last but not least, any book or books you'd like to recommend to the audience?
Yeah, so I mean, any of like Norman Schwartz, like books about Norman Schwarzkopf, like his autobiography, and then other books that have been written about him. I think he's a modern, like Eisenhower is a leader I really respect. Like of all the like U.S. Army military leaders, probably Ulysses S. Grant and Eisenhower are the two historical ones that I gravitate to in terms of like their life stories, because of how humble they were in their leadership. Like if you know anything about Eisenhower and Grant, the burden of leadership in terms of the challenge they faced fighting the Civil War and World War II, and yet how humble, like the servant leadership in terms of how they approach that, and even in their post-military life, how humble, like they didn't really cash in on that. They could have very easily, but if you know anything about Grant, like he lived a very humble life after being president, and as did Eisenhower. So so books about them. But on the business side of things, my favorite two are probably What Got You Here Won't Get You There, which I think is a very applicable book for military veterans, because it's about shifting your mindset and making shifts by taking what worked for you in the past and that define who you are, but repurposing it or realigning it to where you're trying to go. I think in the military, that's a great book for veterans to read. And the other one that I really like is one called Lean Thinking, which is more about what I think military veterans will really appreciate, because it's about production systems and about how production systems work. But I think veterans in particular will look at how you streamline and optimize production systems, translates very well to how things operate in the military. So like Lean Thinking is a great kind of like, I think, transitional book for translating military concepts to business concepts. And like I said, What Got You Here Won't Get You There is great for taking what worked, like take the leadership, the risk management, the people leadership, all the things that you respected about the Army, or the military, but repurpose it to your civilian life, and you'll find that there's ways to do that in that book that I think are very applicable. So.
Really interesting, man. I hadn't heard of those last two you mentioned. I'm intrigued. I'm going to put them on my list. Mike, thanks so much for jumping on the show and sharing your story today, man. It was a real pleasure. I learned a lot from your story and what you had to say. Thank you, man.
Yeah, and thank you for creating this forum. And one thing I didn't touch on, if you don't mind me just saying in closing, is like I really want to pay a lot of respect to my company in terms of how they have created a space for veterans. I mean, Skanska is like a truly special place in terms of how they do outreach for veterans. Like it's more than just showing up at a job fair or posting to social media that we care about veterans. I mean, on our job sites, they do like these really cool things where they recognize, because we have employees that are currently or slated to deploy. They're still in the reserves and whatnot. So like we have these kind of like playbooks or guidelines to help civilians in construction do things that are respectful of veterans in a way that veterans would appreciate. We do care packages for people that are deployed. They, like every Veterans Day, they send all the veterans. Skanska adorn apparel with they came up with like a veteran patch that we wear that only the veterans get at our almost annual company event. Like last year for the company event, it's called Jet.Build. They brought all the veterans on the stage and they did a big thing recognizing the veterans. So I think for veterans, and this is where I'll close, like please, if you're interested in construction, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. I will tell you, construction as an industry, you will find a very welcome home for your skills, and at Skanska especially, I think you'll find a place that really knows how to respect and treat veterans well. So I wanted to close there. So.
Oh yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's awesome. I love to hear that. I'm going to leave your LinkedIn information in the show notes. I'll leave Skanska information in the show notes as well. For our listeners, just go ahead, click that, reach out to Mike, reach out to Skanska in general. That's awesome, man. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Absolutely. Hope to see you soon in Boston, man.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right. Take care. Thank you to our channel sponsors, Jet.Build. If you're looking for ways to better manage your real estate development and construction projects, look no further. Jet is the command center software for end-to-end real estate development and construction management. That's www.jet.build.